with James O'Brien.
3 minutes after 10 is the time. A very good morning indeed to you. I hope you're well. I hope you're making your way to wherever you are currently trying to make your way to in an unmolested and speedy fashion. I'm afraid I didn't have the pleasure of that experience this morning, which is partly why we will begin by discussing climate change and protests, and particularly the question of, if you really, really care about something, what else can you do? A little later in the programme, we will hopefully have time to look at this epidemic of gambling that's broken out among young people. And the really scary thing for the parents among us is, of course, the fact that if your child is caught up in this world, there's a realistic possibility you won't even know, depending on how old they are and how their pocket money and what have you is arranged. We will return, I think, to that story that we didn't have time for yesterday. The fish and chip shop owner, you heard this covered on Nick's show, Rachel Venables, branching out into fish and chip frying as a second career option. But I'm interested in the mechanics of this job-seeking process. I'm not going to lie to you, I would not want to work in a chippy for minimum wage. And if I was unemployed and I had to go to various job opportunities to demonstrate to the job centre that I was actually looking for work, I would do what these people have done. I'd jump through the hoop while waiting for a job I would prefer. And I don't think that makes me feckless, work-shy, or indeed a layabout. I had a mate who worked in a chippy when I was at college, and he stank. And I love fish and chips. Don't get me wrong. I really love fish and chips. I've reached an age now where I kind of look at fish and chips in the way that I used to look at sort of nightclubs. It's a treat on a level that's it's about as good as it gets. But the owner of this chippy says that it's the handouts that mean hardly anyone turns up for work. It's a familiar refrain. We shall examine whether or not it is true. We're also going to have a look, I hope, at the Spanish response to the so-called Brexit deal that's on the table, and the G word finally appears in coverage. Yet another prediction that I derive no pleasure whatsoever from seeing come true. I said, and they haven't even started on Gibraltar yet. Just wait until Gibraltar moves into the firing line. Well, it looks like now it is, and it could have astonishing ramifications, believe it or not, for Scottish independence. I will be explaining to you precisely why and how Gibraltar and Brexit could combine to increase the possibilities of not just Scottish independence, but Scotland somehow remaining in or reapplying to the European Union. Okay. I as you know, I'm being in a very self-congratulatory mode lately for having a mind that is changeable. And it's almost every day I find myself stumbling across a story that I once used to treat on the programme very differently from how I treat it today. The kind of sons of Swampy who undertake these kind of environmental protests used to be quite high on my hit list. I list the people that I found tiresome at best and downright noisome at worst, because I don't see what gives anyone else the right to disrupt my day. That was my old position, and my day just got disrupted pretty badly. I was sitting in traffic, we've all been there, wondering what the hell was going on, getting to work, and finding out from Joanne Webb, who will be, for listeners in London, providing travel updates through the course of the morning on this programme, because of the special circumstances. Asked Joanne Webb what's going on, and she said, I think there's some protesters running into the road and sitting down. And you know, what's your gut shot reaction to that? Hand on heart. Come on, look me in the eye. Your gut reaction to that is, flipping plonkers, isn't it? It is, right? What about suffragettes? Chaining themselves to railings, throwing themselves under horses at the Derby, trying to disrupt just about every area of public life in pursuit of a vote for women. Do you know what? I've been reading a bit about the suffragettes lately. A lot of opposition to them. In fact, had there been phone-in radio programmes during the era of the suffragettes, I'm 99.9% certain I could open up my phone lines and see the switchboard light up like the proverbial Christmas tree by simply inviting you to ring in and tell me why the suffragettes really get on your nerves. And what about those civil rights people? You know, sitting on seats at milk bars in Woolworths, or Rosa Parks thinking she's got the right to sit on a bus in a seat that's designated for white people. Why can't they just accept the status quo and get on with getting on with it? I'm not being silly, I'm just reflecting on the fact that throughout history, disrupting normality in order to change things profoundly is unpopular, to begin with. The campaigners, William Blake and his mates, who campaigned to end the practice of sending children up chimneys, were attacked by the 19th century equivalent of the so-called Taxpayers Alliance and their hard-right, mysteriously funded mates at 55 Tufton Street. That's interfering with the economy. Politics and religion have no business interfering with entrepreneurial flair. Those little rascals belong up chimneys. It was unpopular. I kid you not, it was unpopular. William Blake was regarded as a troublemaker of the very highest order. I'm doing this off the top of my head. I probably should have made a list, but you can add something to this list yourself now. Disrupting normality is unpopular because it irritates us. It inconveniences us. It makes us late for work. It makes us angry. It makes us cross. But does it make us think about the thing that the protesters are protesting? I don't know. I wasn't around for the suffragettes. I wasn't around when kids were being shoved up chimneys. I have a suspicion that I would have been on the side of the kids up the chimneys and indeed on the side of the suffragettes, but I don't know. I wasn't on the side of the climate protesters back in the day. I first started doing this job. If some son of Swampy turned up trying to block access to Heathrow so the planes couldn't take off, or trying to block the motorway so the cars couldn't drive, my initial and abiding reaction was irritation. And yours is as well, isn't it? I know it is, unless you are a son of Swampy. For younger listeners, Swampy was the kind of king of the eco-warriors who dug himself into a tunnel and refused to come out. He was either in a tunnel or up a tree. That's the modus operandi. Do you know, I've got a feeling Swampy did both. I think he was tunnel and tree. And the idea is that you become a human obstacle to the diggers. You're seeing it a little bit now with the fracking sites, the protests at the fracking sites. You use yourself to prevent the diggers and the machinery from moving in. A bit like the suffragettes would chain themselves to railings so that normal business could not continue. It had to be disrupted. It had to be stopped. It's possible I've gone mad, and that the parallels with the civil rights movement and the suffragettes are utterly pie in the sky, but it works for me at the moment. You want to have a pop at it, then you know the number, 0345 6060 973. The fascinating thing about this is the question of whether or not it works. So what you have today in town, and this is, we all breathe the same air, so it's not just a national issue, it's an international issue. About 35 protesters from this group Extinction Rebellion have launched a series of what they call swarming protests in the capital on Wednesday. This is a campaign of mass civil disobedience, okay? That's where the parallels with the civil rights movement and the suffragettes work for me, and indeed the child chimney sweeps. But does it make you think about the problem they're protesting? That's my only real question for you this morning. 0345 6060 973. See, obviously Nick and I sing from quite different hymn sheets on these sort of issues now. I used to be much closer to his position, but even he's been talking about it all morning. So in what other circumstances would a petrol head like Nick be talking about climate change? Answer, only when these protesters pitch camp in the middle of the A4. When would I be talking about it? Beth is big on climate change, the producer of this programme, and I kind of... Don't tell her I said this, but I get quite bored of her asking me to do it on the programme. I kind of find myself a little irritated sometimes by having to explain once again why it's not a subject that will engage you. She quite rightly points out it's my job to engage you, and if I can't turn a threat to the entire planet into a subject that you and I both find interesting, then I should probably think about doing something else for a living. I say, how dare you talk to me like that? I'm the presenter of this programme. And she says, well, why don't you go on and present it then, and present something really important like climate change in a way that makes people realise how important it is? And I say, well, I do enjoy these conversations. Time for the travel news. 12 minutes after 10 is the time. But she's right, isn't she? I don't get it. It's got something to do with short-termism and long-termism. The idea that I can make you cross about something at the end of your street, but I can't really make you cross about something that might happen at the end of the century. Give us a call. 0345 6060 973 is the number. You see, you think I make this stuff up. I've already had a text, and I presume this isn't a parody. The First World War got women the vote. The suffragettes were terrorists. So there you have it. And the climate change protesters are terrorists. And the civil rights champions were terrorists. They were disrupting normal life in order to change the status quo in pursuit of a political principle they considered to be profoundly important, but which the public at large considered to be an irritation. But we wouldn't be talking about it if they weren't pitching camp in the middle of the motorway. Discuss. 0345 60 60 973. With the greatest of love and respect, don't ring me to tell me that you don't believe in climate change, or indeed that there's no point us ever doing anything because China. All right, I'm familiar with those phrases. I'm familiar with those arguments. Plenty of other phone-in shows in the programme, where in the world, where you can ring in and get given a biscuit for spouting some hard-right, mysteriously funded propaganda that you've been persuaded is somehow news or relevant to the broader issues. Okay, we'll deal only with reality on this programme. The reality is climate change is altering the very nature of our planet. Floods and extreme weather conditions are occurring now in areas where they have never occurred before. Donald Trump remains in denial, but Donald Trump remains in the pocket, of course, of the fossil fuel industry. The fossil fuel industry is increasingly clear, funding precisely the hard-right, dodgy lobby groups masquerading as think tanks who miraculously produce research on a regular basis, arguing that the fossil fuel industry is great and we should all chill out a bit about climate change. So you're welcome to swallow that, but you're not, I'm afraid, today, welcome to regurgitate it on my programme. Today I want to talk about whether it works. Whether it works. Because in the final analysis, I could get one of these guys on and dance with him, or he could duff me up, or I could duff him up. But whatever you do, we're talking about it. And the only reason we're talking about it is because they've pitched camp in the middle of the motorway. So, despite being irritated, despite being annoyed, despite being inconvenienced, despite the fact that I was nearly late for work, which would be a tragedy of epic proportions, a national scandal, there'd be questions in the House of Commons if I wasn't here to pour pearls into your ear at 10 o'clock every morning. Despite all of that, they've pulled it off, right? Because we're talking about it. And somewhere deep inside us, a little seed has been sown, which is linked to Extinction Rebellion's protests. But I'm not going to lie to you. They hacked me right off this morning.
This is LBC.
19 minutes after 10. It's really annoying, and they're not the most sympathetic or prepossessing of characters, but it works, right? Because everyone's talking about climate change, from a petrol head like Nick in the breakfast show right through to me, who's not really a petrol head, but hasn't historically had much nice to say about the sons of Swampy, who think they've got the right to make me late for work in order to make me think about the state of the planet. But I know they're right, deep down. Just can't quite admit it yet. Alice is in Northwich. Alice, what would you like to say?
Yes, I mean, I would support what they're doing.
It's all very well for you in Northwich. If it was happening in Northwich, I'd support it here in London, but you can't support it from Northwich. It's making me late for work, woman.
No, but I can't support it at my age either, because I'm in my 70s.
But it works.
Well, I think it works. I mean, I think, I think this, you sort of have to strike a balance between what people are prepared to do. But I think disrupting, I mean, obviously, after my many years of living, from time to time, my journeys have been disrupted by people protesting against various things. And sometimes you think, well, I disagree, and this is totally irritating. And then other times you think, well, yes, maybe they've got a point. And one would hope if an ambulance comes racing along, or a fire engine,
they'd get out of the flipping way, sharpish. Of course, but you say, I mean, this is the problem. You're already on side. This is what I'm intrigued by. The best moments on the programme are the moments of transformation, aren't they, or realisation. You're already on the same team as the protesters. What I need to work out today is whether anyone like me, who's had their morning disrupted, is likely to think about the issue they're raising in a more positive and progressive fashion. And I'm not sure that will happen. I mean, it certainly doesn't happen explicitly, does it?
Well, I thought it was extremely good that you mentioned that. I think you mentioned that one of your children has a school playground that is.
Yes, I've got to talk about that actually, because there's a big star-studded, it's a celebrity-studded protest going on, and no one asked me to get involved, Alice. And there was me thinking I'd got off the Z list onto the Y list earlier this year.
And I mean, I think if people sort of think just selfishly about themselves, about their children. I mean, I say to my my nearest and dearest about the children, a bit similar to you. I have a grandson who
make it matter.
Yes, absolutely. Make them realise that it's them, that that it's the buses standing.
Well, that's what we need. We need to find someone sat in traffic today who sat there and thought, actually, do you know what? I'm incredibly irritated, but my kids breathe this air.
Yeah.
I like it.
And it's not just what one can smell. Of course, it's the microscopic particulates, as they're called, that get deep into the lungs, and especially young children. And they're being pushed around in these buggies, or they're driving around in cars which don't have adequate
and it is
air
killing people.
conditioning.
It is actually killing people, although it never appears on death certificates. And that is, a really crucial point. Alice, thank you. This is Gary Fuller, who's written a book about this issue. And he points out humans can live for 3 weeks without food and 3 days without water, but only 3 minutes without air. Think about that for a minute. Gosh. Yes, we simply take our air for granted, he writes. It's a frustrating paradox. Air pollution claims thousands of lives in London every year, yet is never listed on a death certificate. We might get Gary Fuller in next week. He's written a book about this issue. So Alice is, if you like, already in the choir. To whom are these protesters preaching most effectively today? Matt is in High Wycombe. Matt, what would you like to say?
James, thanks for taking my call. I've got a couple of points, and hopefully we'll get some. First of all, I'd like to say climate protest is completely needed. If I can compare it with something like apartheid, which was clearly a human rights issue and an obvious problem, but far away, I'm sure that inconvenienced lots of people for lots of years in Trafalgar Square and elsewhere, but the protest was still needed. All peaceful protest is disruptive for people trying to get through it.
And I mean, that's the bottom line, is it? I mean, will people wake up without these sort of protests? I keep referring back to Nick's show, because he historically is a lot more sceptical about these issues than I am, and he is talking about it because of these protesters, and that by a process of osmosis, just by listening to these conversations, you think about the issues more.
Well, of course, I mean, we knew that the air was poisoned 3 or 4 days ago. We know that plastic is poisoned 3 or 4 days ago, but before this protest happened, we were all ignoring it. We know that it's costing the NHS millions because extra asthma treatments and all the low birth weight problems and all the obesity caused by people using cars instead of walking and cycling to school. We know all of those issues, but sadly we need a jolt to get us out of our comfort zone.
Yeah, but again, you're in the choir, Matt.
Sure, that is true. But what I would say is to people, people who don't believe in climate change, or people who have an issue with it from a left-wing perspective, do some reading. There are right-wing reasons to be afraid of climate change, not least
yes, of course.
Security reasons. I mean, at the moment, there's a situation where there's massive droughts in the whole of the Middle East, and places like Iraq would be at war with Turkey, but for the fact that Iraq is a disaster.
And closer to home, there's a brilliant vignette at the end of Al Gore's last film, and a really, really right-wing Republican mayor of a town, I think in Florida, has realised the self-interest that's attached to tackling climate change, because it costs a hell of a lot of money to deal with floods and to clean up afterwards and to rebuild buildings that have been structurally damaged and all that sort of thing. So you're right, and I think that's probably the future, but I think there might be another chapter to be written before we reach the chapter where we're tackling climate change out of self-interest, and Matt quite rightly uses right-wing there as a synonym for self-interested or selfish. 26 minutes after 10. Michael is in Vauxhall. Michael, what would you like to say? Michael? OK, 26 minutes after 10 is the time. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC. Seb's in Stoke-on-Trent. Seb, what would you like to say?
James, two things. First of all, your book's great. Second of all, your show is great.
Can't argue with that either, mate. You're good. Go for the hat-trick.
I just think that in terms of environmental stuff and environmental crime in particular, the world isn't necessarily in tune to it yet, especially in the West, because we don't see it. Yeah. So if you go to much more poor places in the world where you have things like toxic waste dumping and other things, those people are seeing the effects of pollution and whatever else, and plastic. Toxic waste dumping is I mean, there was a whale washed up with something like 8 kilograms of plastic in its stomach yesterday. So we do get the occasional reminder, but you're right, it all feels at arm's length. Except that, surely the forest fires in California, and there were floods in Spain recently, in an area where I've been on holiday. I never would have
had it down as a place that was at risk of really, really serious flooding. Ditto in Florida, you know, the town's under threat of disappearance on the coast of Florida, and they're quite closer to home, aren't they? And still, you've got a president in the White House who's absolutely in denial, and you've got a kind of broader sense that the population, even if it kind of acknowledges that there is a problem, isn't really ready yet to do anything about it.
Well, yeah, that's the thing. I think, you know, there's small steps being taken. So obviously there is acknowledgement of the issues around plastic. So there's introduction of more plastic bags. There's charges from plastic straws. But in reality, those are small changes for something that, you know, in 10, 20, 30 years, we are going to see the effects of. And if, you know, so for one example, fishless oceans. If we see fishless oceans, around a third of the planet relies on that as its food source. So if we talk about migration now, once that source of protein, you know, has vanished for a lot of the people in particular poor parts of the world.
It's far off, Seb. I mean, you're clearly right, but it's so I can't make it sting. Do you know what I mean? I can't serve it up in a way that makes somebody sit up from their newspaper or whatever they're doing at the moment, sitting in traffic probably if they're in town, and just go, yeah, actually that really, how do you make it matter if it doesn't actually affect you? And even if it is affecting you through the quality of the air that you breathe, you're not aware of it.
No, you're not. And, you know, it's like your previous call was saying about the deaths from pollution. Those aren't considered. We don't sort of take an approach towards it where we actually see it as a harmful thing, because ultimately we live in a society that promotes business and whatever else. So if you've got an idea and it works and it helps people get along, do their jobs more effectively, we support that. But what we don't include in that is like the footprint of it. So when we have planes and cars and whatever else that uses petrol and diesel, we're not considering the fact that people are dying from these.
Yeah, but
diseases.
It's convenience. It's convenience versus catastrophe. It's a bit to draw an odd parallel, seeing as you mentioned my book at the beginning of the call. It's you know, for sale on Amazon. I would rather that everyone was buying my book from a local bookshop. Whether at a discount or at full price doesn't affect the royalties that I get, but they're knocking it out for $4.99 on Amazon. I use Amazon, so I can't sit here and say don't do that. And yet I somehow know that in the great scheme of things, we should be doing something differently. But I'm not prepared to inconvenience myself in order to do what I know is right, despite the title. It's coming out to 10:30. Thank you, Seb. Quick line here. This is what they're doing. The lights go red. They go and sit down in the road, wait 7 minutes. If anybody needs to get past, we'll let them through. We come off after 7 minutes, take a break, let the angry drivers at the front go. Then the light goes red and you go on again. It's about causing economic disruption by slowing things down, bringing things to a gridlock. This is an experiment, really. I think that's the most important word. I could quite easily conjure up a little bit of rage, righteous outrage at this. What do you mean it's an experiment? What am I, some sort of guinea pig? How dare you conduct an experiment upon me without my permission? That's vivisection, that's disgraceful, that's disgusting. But somewhere underneath that righteous indignation is a little bit of guilt. And that guilt is born of knowledge. And that knowledge is that they're on the right side of history. Simon Conway's here with the headlines.
The new Work and Pensions Secretary says she thinks the likelies.
10:35 is the time. The lights go red. They go into and sit down in the road. Wait 7 minutes. If anybody needs to get past, we'll let them through. Come off after 7 minutes. Take a break. Let the angry drivers at the front go. Then the light goes red and you go on again. Could be happening anywhere. Today it's happening in London. The organisers of this protest say this is about causing economic disruption by slowing things down, bringing things to a gridlock. This is an experiment, really. I think that's the most important word. I wonder how the lab rats feel. Rachel Venables is at the scene. Rachel, how's the experiment going?
Mixed results, I think, James, because we've had a number of people come up and say, well done. A woman just pushing a pram with a small child inside it went up to the group of people who were blocking the road. She thanked them. She said, you guys are doing a great job. But just seconds before talking to you, a teacher came up to the group of protesters here. I cannot quote, I think, even half of what he said because it was so full of expletives and swear words. He was absolutely furious, telling the group that he's got a set of 30-odd 8-year-olds apparently stuck in a coach back in the queues of traffic. Yeah. No, he was only swearing to the protesters, but he was absolutely furious. He said they've had a day trip out in London, completely ruined because of this protest. And that's the real variation, I think, of opinions that we've had here this morning. As I say, people saying thank you and people absolutely losing their temper at the group who have been, as you already described, blocking the road. So when I got here earlier, the sound of the beeping horns was completely deafening. Oh, as if on cue now. Yeah. And what you've got is the group of protesters. There's only about half a dozen of them here. They've got a huge banner, huge green banner. They're walking across the road, standing from pavement to pavement, blocking off the traffic. They stand there for 7 minutes and then they let the traffic go. So they're at a break at the moment. That's why you might be able to hear the rumble of cars going past. I'm joined by one of the protesters, Josie.
Hello.
Talk to me about what you're trying to do today. What are you trying to achieve with this?
So today we are creating some light disruption across the city, momentarily blockading the roads to raise awareness, spark some thoughts and get people thinking and get a bit of disruption in the city so that people are aware that we are here and we're aware that we're not happy with the current state of the planet and we're trying to instigate some change in the current system.
Does it work? I mean, something like this, you've made people late for work. I mentioned the teacher who was delayed. Even James O'Brien, my presenter, was late in this morning. I couldn't work out why he wasn't in the office as I left here. It was very unlike him. I mean, you're affecting so many people here.
Yeah, I mean, the momentary sort of lateness for work and school is unfortunate, and it's unfortunate these people aren't who we're targeting. However, this kind of disruption of the city does create awareness throughout the media, throughout many different people that may not have been thinking about this before they were on their way to work. One day of 2 hours late for work to think about the planet, I think, is a justified cause, and it gets people aware. It gets people thinking that they might not have thought about this beforehand. They might not be aware of what's going on, and especially for sort of higher authorities which are difficult to reach. If you can write letters, emails, you don't get responses a lot of the time. However, this is something that they have to stop and think about because a lot of the city's in congestion and a lot of people have to rearrange their days.
Rachel.
Yes,
No,
of course.
Rachel, could you just tell Josie, one of my daughters does write letters and emails and campaigns passionately about climate change, but she started crying this morning when she realised she was going to be late for school because she'll get a conduct mark. Could you just ask Josie to send a message to my daughter?
Of course. So James wants a message to his daughter, who he says this morning was crying because she was going to be late to school, but she does write letters, she does care about climate change, she is trying. What would you say to someone like her?
Firstly, I'd apologise that you were upset that you were late for school. I don't want to negatively affect anyone's education in any way.
She's not just upset, she got a conduct mark. She gets punished for being late.
Doing what you're doing, any kind of sort of instigation towards change.
I mean, she actually got punished for being late. She got a conduct mark, so it affects her schooling. It affects the way she's seen, I guess, by the teacher.
And she's on the same team as Josie.
Well, I have. I could propose writing a letter to the school and taking responsibility for her being late, as it's not entirely the fault of her actions. I've already been on camera for somebody's boss today saying, as I was trying to calm down the traffic and apologise and thank them for their patience, they filmed me and I said, I'm sorry to whoever's boss this is, they are going to be momentarily late for this blockade, it's not their fault, and I don't believe that she should be punished for it, and if the school is aware, or if her teachers can be aware that it's not her direct doings that cause her to be late.
I guess what I'd ask is there not better things you could be doing? Is there not something that would create this level of attention but that wouldn't affect people like James's daughter, like the school kids we've heard about being trapped on the coach, like the people who are late for work?
Yeah, I mean, I guess the advantage of being in a blockade is that you are sort of forcing people to stop and take notice. By being in a public place on the side of a road or a park, people can walk by you and ignore you. However, this forces people to stop and think about what's going on for a moment. It sort of instigates people to actually consider what's going on, rather than it's very easy to walk by and ignore it and put your blinkers on and pretend it's not happening, but when you're stuck in a traffic jam you can't really pretend that's not happening.
And can I just ask quickly, how do you feel when someone walks up to you and is so aggressive, is swearing, is furious, is angry, you've ruined their day, how dare you? How do you feel when someone says that sort of thing to you when you're here, as far as you're aware, trying to save the planet?
Well, it doesn't feel good, initially, of course. It does hurt a bit, but I try to understand and see things from their perspective as well, because it's not ideal being late for anything. I just try and sort of get a bit of a protective shield up and try and remember that it's not directly at my person and just sort of brush it off as a kind of, a lot of people have this kind of negative view against all sort of protesters and blockades, and they may or may not recognise the cause and just think, oh, there's disruption and I'm annoyed at it. A lot of people haven't given me time to speak. They've come and vented, and that's also important too. If people are angry, it's, whatever emotions they're feeling, it's good for them to express that. So I allow them to express without taking it on too much myself.
Josie, thank you very much for speaking to me. So as I say, the rumble of traffic is still going past now onto Vauxhall Bridge, but I think soon they'll be picking up the banners again and blocking off the traffic. This has been going on in other parts of London as well, places like Earl's Court this morning, for example. Other bridges also affected, and I understand this is going to go on for a couple of days as well. So this isn't the end that we're hearing this sort of action taken in London.
Rachel Venables, great stuff, reporting live there from one of these protests that is designed to make us recognise the importance of addressing climate change. And that was a very personal interaction with me, a very personal contribution, which highlights everything about this issue, actually, that should concern us. Because these people are right. We're not doing enough. And the reason why we're not doing enough is that we're not properly aware of the scale of the problems, and we're not properly sensitive to the impact of these problems. But it's incredibly annoying. You've got an upset child, or you've got a meeting that you're late for, or you've got, in my case, just that little wobble of fear as we've been sitting stationary for about 8 minutes. I now understand why it was about 8 minutes, because obviously somewhere further up the road they were doing a 7-minute sit in the road and then hopping off the road again. It really gets my goat. But they're right. This is probably the best example yet of that thing that we've just started swimming against in the last few months, which is pick a side, put your scarf on, start swearing and screaming furiously at the other lot, regardless of what the actual facts and evidence might be, because they are the enemy and you are the good guys. And I can't do that anymore on these issues, because this binary bandwidth has rendered entire countries crippled. Look at Brexit. It's insane. We've got to be more intelligent. So here's an intelligent question for you. If you're spitting nails this morning, you will appreciate by now that I completely understand why, but I also completely understand why the protesters are doing what they're doing. So if you're spitting nails this morning, what would be better? What do you think might have drawn your attention to this crisis more effectively than this protest? Because if you can't come up with something better that would have made you go, yeah, right, that's it, I'm definitely... See, I might catch the tube into work tomorrow. A lot of you are expressing outrage at the idea that I drive to work in the morning while talking about climate change when I get there. That's a ridiculous accusation. I don't drive to work in the morning. I'm driven to work. But I might get the tube tomorrow simply to be certain of making my way in at the usual pace. The problem is I don't get a seat. But in the great scheme of things, the state of the planet versus whether or not my pert buttocks can rest on a cushioned seat on the district line, that's kind of where we are, isn't it? Because I will be cross. I'll be standing on the tube with a little ache in my calves, thinking, damn those protesters, and they'll be sitting there thinking, we're actually saving the planet. I don't know how you segue from that level of perfectly forgivable selfishness to that level of planetary altruism. And that's the problem they've got. So if you've got a problem with what they're doing, what would have worked better? On you, not on some random theoretical stranger, but on you, sitting there in your car, spitting nails at these protesters. But they've got me talking about climate change, and they got Nick talking about climate change. Two very different perspectives on the world right there. And then there's your perspective on the world as well, and you're now thinking about it, even if you're still furious. What would have worked better? I can't think of anything.
Eddie Mayer, weekdays from...
10:50 is the time. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC, where the sad truth is the protesters are right, and I'm not going to get irritated with anyone who's furious about the protesters ruining their day. I don't know, how does this shake down? How does the twain meet? So I guess one question that would be interested in is, if you're stuck and cross, what would have worked better to focus your mind on the urgency of the climate change issue? It's 10 to 11. Marcus is in Kingston. Marcus, what would you like to say?
Well, I was stuck in traffic. I've just pulled out of the traffic to make the call.
Oh, good man.
And at first I was upset, purely because I'm thinking I've got to get somewhere, somebody's waiting for me, and I don't know whether the traffic is due to this or not. It's just solid traffic. Obviously, I can't see what's at the front of it.
Yeah.
And as I'm listening to you on the radio, I'm thinking, well, yeah, actually, I'm the one being affected by this protest, and they're right. And the seismic change that has to happen with us, we can't comprehend the seismic change that we have to do. The only way the world's going to survive is if we stop fishing. That's the only way, and that's such a thing we can't comprehend. Yeah, in our lifetime, 50% of the fish have gone. Of the animals in the sea have gone. We can't comprehend that idea that fishing has to stop, because there's no such thing as sustainable fishing.
Well, there must be sustainable fishing. I mean, I hear you. That's clearly a hobby horse of yours. It's not necessarily what the protesters today are focusing on. I think that's more the pollution that's done by fossil fuels and what have you. But you're right. You're quite right to point out that they're all linked. So if this programme was on in every car stuck in traffic, and we were having our nuanced and evidence-based conversation about what's going on, then you think a lot of the anger might dissipate.
Well, it's the fact that we've got to change so much, and as one of your earlier callers said about straws and plastic bags, they're all positive things, and we are moving forwards. And in fact, the interview with one of the protesters, she said we're moving forward, but not quick enough, and that I think that's their point. And us being delayed an hour, 2 hours, actually we're talking about the planet and surviving, and our kids surviving. And weirdly enough, if my daughter was late for school and got a point, and she's had balloon releases, cancelled at school, and she's had tuna taken off the menu, etc., etc. So she's really pushing it. If she got punished, I think you should be proud of it. Why was I punished? Because... And
of course, if now that we know the reason why the traffic was so bad, I'm sure that all schools, including the one that my girl goes to, will not be imposing the conduct marks and the punishments, because there was clearly nothing that any child could do about it. But that's interesting, isn't it? So knowledge is power, and when you realised what the reason might be for the traffic jam that was irritating you, you suddenly became a lot more sanguine about it. But again, you're already in the choir. I'm interested in knowing what... And of course, making the choir sing louder is a result for the protesters, but I'm interested in people who've been or are being converted. That's the thing, isn't it?
Yeah.
Wake up for the first time to the issue. And I guess you just don't know whether that happens or not. Michael is in Vauxhall. Michael, which is exactly where the problems are. What would you like to say, Michael?
Morning, James. Well, I just wanted to comment as somebody who's actually just been through this. I just arrived home from Vauxhall,
Yes.
From the other side of the river via Nine Elms, so I was in the traffic an hour and a half.
Oh, Lordy.
Listen, don't get the wrong impression. I thoroughly agree with the concept of us trying to stem this problem with climate change, but they are undoubtedly going the wrong way about it.
Go on.
There were 200,000 cars queuing from every direction possible going towards Vauxhall. I mean, that may be a slight exaggeration, but there were an awful lot. All pumping out nitrous oxide and goodness knows what else.
Absolutely. And taking a lot longer on their journey, which involves pumping out nitrous oxide, than they would have done if it wasn't for the protest.
I mean, absolutely. All right? So that's for number one reason that it's simply a dumb idea, because you're actually creating more pollution.
Yeah, if they did it every day, you'd have absolutely a stone-cold case. But if they do it very, very occasionally and very, very effectively, you see it as a
on Saturday,
a net loss for a gross gain.
They did the same thing over five bridges. I was, again, in Vauxhall, because that's where I live.
Yes.
And I had to travel out halfway to Heathrow to turn back up and eventually go on the A1. I was going up to Rutland, that direction.
Oh, lovely.
So, okay, that was an extra, whatever it was on the journey, half an hour.
So they're contributing to the problem that they're protesting against.
Absolutely. No,
there's a symmetry to that.
Your question, which I think was a very good one, which is how we should best bring this to other people's notice.
Yes, I was literally about to ask you that. He's producing himself, this caller. This is fantastic. Carry on.
There we have it. My view is you should go to where the problem stems from. It's like disease doesn't start with the cold. It stems from a problem with the body politic, if you will.
Yes.
And in this case, the problem with climate change is exacerbated by any number of different things that the modern world creates. We've mentioned plastic. I've listened to you talking about plastics. Very much pesticides. Go and sort of hole up in front of Monsanto Bayer. Go and hold up.
They do that, and we don't talk. You would not be ringing me today if they were holed up outside Monsanto Bayer. You're only ringing me today because you've been personally inconvenienced.
Like effort last, whenever it was recently, and they got arrested for actually doing nothing particularly. They weren't doing anything much other than holding up traffic on whichever road it was in Lancashire somewhere. The
frackers.
I'm sure.
They went to prison, though.
So, actually, I don't think that's true. I think they would be. But anyway, the point is, it's they that need to be inconvenienced because actually their products should be banned.
Well, but that is if I went into the shops and removed all their products in a great big sack and got arrested, that would get the impact and the attention that you're describing. If I stood outside with my little placard saying, down with this sort of thing, I wouldn't get any attention at all. This is the nature of humanity, actually, in that you don't get noticed by being quiet and right. Yeah, it's the speak your weight machine versus the ghost train again, except sometimes the forces of righteousness have to employ the tactics of the ghost train. Otherwise, no one will notice that they're there. And yet Michael's point is mathematically inarguable. What is it you're protesting about? Oh, the pollution that's done by fossil fuels. And how exactly are you doing that? By massively increasing the amount of pollution done by fossil fuels for the duration of our protest. OK. Michael, thank you. Alexander is in Hove. Alexander, what would you like to say?
So I've been a member of the Green Party now for about 5-6 years-ish.
Well, you are in the only part of the country where that makes massive political sense, aren't you?
Yeah, and that's kind of the problem. The electoral system should be there so that we can affect change. Our political system doesn't allow for change, especially on these kinds of issues. You go around, and even somewhere like here, you go knocking on doors and you talk to people, and, they say, I'd love to vote for you, I care about climate change, but you're not going to get in.
Yeah.
But when your reporter asks the protester, could you do anything else? No, not really. I don't think so. You can try and get elected. You can
first past the post.
Try.
You're right, exactly.
If you can't get into Parliament, you can't do anything about the big issues. And at the moment, we've only got one woman in. She's a fantastic MP, but she's one woman. She can't do everything on her own.
Why did that happen? I mean, I've got a couple of friends from Brighton. Ivan, the studio producer, is from Brighton. Are they all massive hippies?
No.
Well, how do you get a Green MP then?
I'm not a massive. I look the opposite of a hippie.
Oh, skinhead? You look like Vivian out of the Young Ones.
Yeah, no, that's definitely true.
But why? How come you've got, for people at the other end of the country, how come Brighton has a Green Party MP?
I'm not actually sure. I joined him in about 2013. In 2010, I was doing my GCSEs in another part of the country, so I couldn't tell you.
Sure. But it did just happen. I mean, it is just a concentration of population, and somehow people must have gravitated towards Brighton. There can't be anything in the water in Brighton that has made them more environmentally conscious than the rest of the country. That that's the kind of thing that I suspect journalism should have been addressing in recent years, instead of banging on about immigration and Brussels all the time. How come this one city has actually returned an MP who is representative of what matters most at this point in human history? So you hop over to Germany, the Green Party is going great. Again, you probably don't know that, but you're aware of what the far-right neo-Nazis are doing in the polls. The Greens are just as resurgent, or not even resurgent. Is surgent a word? If you can be resurgent, can you be surgent? Anyway, the Greens are surging just as much as the fascists, but we here in Britain don't write stories about the Greens doing amazingly well in German elections, because, understandably, we kind of have a fetish for the neo-Nazi story. Thank you, Alexander. It's 11 o'clock. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC.
On your radio.
4 minutes after 11 is the time. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC. I'm going to talk next about children gambling, but I can't really say much about it because it's not a world I am overly familiar with.